Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of PPE in a time of pandemic. This week's topic is research, expertise, and existential risk. I will be your host for this week. My name is Ryan Duty. Well, let me start by introducing our panelists this week. First, we have Benjamin Hale, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Environmental Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And our other panelist on my virtual right is Adrian Curry, who is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Exeter in the UK. So let's jump in. I'll start. Ben, let's start with you. It typically takes a long time for clinical drugs to be developed, tested, and approved. I mean, it can take years to test for a drug's safety and efficacy. But in the midst of a pandemic, we don't really have that kind of time. So we're left with a range of lockdown and social distancing measures that are aimed to change the population level outcomes of the disease. Obviously, as we all are aware, this involves making sacrifices that will be disproportionately devastating for some, and that at another time would have seemed unimaginable in many Western democracies. So the question is, how can we balance the imperatives of democracy and the economic costs of these restrictions with the desire to limit the damage from the disease?
That's a great question. Thanks, Ryan. First, before I get started in the answer to that question, I just want to sort of mention that I'm primarily an environmental and public health ethicist, so I've been sort of working on questions like this for a long time, and a lot of my research kind of functions at the intersection of policy, economics, and ethics. So, you know, for I guess for a long time, I've been thinking about these kinds of questions. Specifically, I was very involved in the Ebola response about 6 or 7 years ago. I wrote a few articles back then. When this kind of broke out, like in late January, mid to late January in China, I remember being incredibly alarmed about what was happening on the ground. I remember watching some of these Twitter feeds of people being welded in homes, in apartment buildings, and so on, where the apartment buildings were blockaded. And I just remember thinking, like, my God, you know, this is an extraordinary state of affairs. We had like first 56 million people were locked down, and then it rose to like 150 million people, and then eventually to 700 million people in China. And I and a few other philosophers started talking about this. And I just remember thinking also that, you know, this is not the kind of thing that could ever happen in a lot of Western democracies. And I kind of crossed my fingers that, that this wouldn't happen to us right here in the US or anywhere else in Western Europe or wherever else. And then, of course, it spread briefly to Japan, and Japan sort of had their own response. Singapore had its response, and then it moved to Italy. And as that unfolded, I, again, was surprised at the speed with which Italy sort of they closed their schools, eventually then closed the north of Italy and the rest. And everybody sort of knows the whole story. I've been amazed at the kind of response that Western democracies and many countries from around the world have had. I think we don't have at our disposal the kinds of responses that obviously China has. They were very effective in imposing their lockdown on the population. And if we did, you know, we might be better equipped to address it. But of course, that does tank the economy. I think, though, that we do have, like in the epidemiological playbook, in the public health playbook, we do have you know, a set of resources that we can rely on that include, you know, practices like obviously social distancing, which we've all learned about, but significant contact tracing and sort of looking or following very closely the progression of a disease that will involve sort of enlisting a lot of not just, you know, public health practitioners, but maybe even legions of, you know, social workers to go and sort of make sure that our activities are limited and our social contact is limited while this disease kind of progresses through the community. I guess what strikes me as like the most important possible response for any country is that we make sure that we're in a way all on the same page. The current state of the U.S. response is essentially relies on individual states to make determinations about what the best course of action is for themselves. And that doesn't strike me as particularly intelligent, at least, or an intelligent pathway to resolve this in an effective manner, in as much as it's just, I mean, it's a kind of a go it alone individualist approach. Doesn't seem like it will provide for us the outcome that we're looking for, and in fact could exacerbate the problem by, creating a bunch of outbreaks and flare-ups throughout the country in a way that we just can't get under control. So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I think that's a way for us to sort of like maintain some grip on democracy and hopefully get our economy back up and running, while also trying to sort of like, dampen the impact of the disease on the human population.
Great, thank you. Adrian, maybe you could jump in here. What balance should researchers in particular strike between accuracy and urgency when attempting to develop vaccines and treatments for COVID-19? Look, what are the dangers of moving too quickly, and what are the dangers of moving too slowly?
Right, well, thanks. I guess that there's a sense in which that's almost a sort of false dichotomy, right? There's this idea we often think about science as being this like, there's the researcher and they're doing this thing. And I have to make a decision about, should the researcher be trying to balance getting it right versus doing it fast? When in reality, particularly if you're talking about medicine, you got to think of it as like a pipeline or a series of sort of pipelines, these processes that are going from someone being like, maybe if I poke this person with this drug, they'll be less sick, to, hey, we now know that this sort of works and it's kind of safe to do it. And so that question is actually much, much more complicated than it looks at first, because if you're a laboratory scientist, then there are questions about, well, how do I balance the cost and time of trying out this particular, possible path to an initial check, as opposed to if I'm someone who is further down that pipeline, if I'm someone who's thinking about putting trials on populations and so on and so forth. And so I think that thinking about this in terms of that sort of more simple trade-off, or it's a trade-off between something like accuracy and speed in the context of, I don't know, being a researcher, is not quite the right way to think about it. What we should be thinking about is rather, I have populations of researchers and I have these various processes that lead to things I can then deploy at populations. What parts of those, how do I want those processes to look? And it strikes me that one thing we really want those processes to look like at this point is at the initial stage, extremely diverse, right? We want to have as many different types of approaches as possible kind of happening, but we then want to have as good as we can sort of filtering mechanisms. We want to be able to tell what are the ideas that have legs as quickly as possible. I think where this trade-off really has bite is not so much at the sort of initial, I'm in a lab and I'm seeing what this thing does to, does to these cells or whatever kind of stage. It's much more at the testing on population stage, right? It's much more of a question of how do I balance the knowledge I have of the possible costs of using this particular treatment, or I think at the moment, more pertinent to the current situation, this particular way of telling whether someone has or doesn't have the virus, as opposed to getting it out to the public more quickly. So I guess the idea that scientists themselves or particular labs or particular research groups are trying to balance things like accuracy and urgency is kind of slightly missing the idea that actually this is a set of these different social processes, a set of pipelines if you want, out of which we're moving from something like initial ideas to actual products. That wasn't really so much answering your question as sort of saying, well, I think actually that's almost the wrong place to ask it. In terms of having a positive answer in terms of, okay, fine, how many people should I test before I'm able to think it's okay to try and use this particularly life-saving thing? That's a really hard question, right? We've already seen with testing things that look like potentially good ways of testing that certain governments may have spent quite a lot of money purchasing. Now it turns out don't work sufficiently for us to be able to do anything with them. And so it's really hard. And partly I think it's because we don't know much about the particular situation that we're in. And so we're swimming in a sort of sea of risk. I mean, Ben might have more to say about how to deal with the risk involved with, I have a thing that I think it might work, but I haven't yet gone and tested it on populations or not sufficiently. That's more outside of what I like to think about, but I think Ben might know more. But I think that's where the real problem is. In terms of the scientific work, like the lab work, whatever you want to call it, that stuff, then I think it's just diversity. You just want to have a bunch of people trying a whole bunch of different things. And then from those that seem promising, push them into those pipelines of, more population level testing as quickly as possible.
Let me ask you another question about a different dichotomy. So in developing treatment and techniques, we could focus on preventative responses, or we could focus on ameliorative responses, or we could strike some sort of balance between the two. Could you say a little bit about what seems like the relative merits of each approach?
Sure. So that's a distinction from medicine, of course. We have like ameliorative medicine, like I have a disease and if I take this will make me better, or I've hurt my leg and if I, put ice on it, it'll make it better or whatever, as opposed to preventative, which is, ride your bicycle with a helmet, because if you fall off, you won't hurt your head. One thing that's interesting about that distinction is that often when we talk about medicine, we're really thinking about ameliorative medicine. We think about being sick as there's this thing wrong with me, I need you to fix me now. Whereas, of course, preventative medicine really expands the way that we think about medicine, right? Suddenly things like eating well counts as medicine, things like wearing bike helmets counts as medicine, so on and so forth. When we're in the midst of a pandemic, similarly to if you have a really, really bad disease, you kind of don't care about preventative, right? You're not in a position to sort of go, well, I guess now that I have brain damage, I guess I should have been wearing a bike helmet before I fell off my bike. But now that I have brain damage, I need to stay awake and drink lots of water and do all the various things you're supposed to when you have brain damage. We're currently in the midst of a pandemic. And so, what we need is ameliorative. And I take it ameliorative are things like these things that Ben mentioned, like things like sort of certain types of social distancing, tracing things of the disease, blah, 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 lockdowns, and eventually developing vaccines and so forth. But I think what's important about thinking about sort of, as it were, the analog and the preventive version you're thinking about pandemics is to think about, well, what is a science, what are the things that count as being part of the science of pandemics when you're thinking about the analog of preventive? Well, it looks much broader, right? We're not just talking about keeping people away from each other, having enough testing things, so on and so forth. We then start thinking about the resilience of the communities that we're in, right? I think it's important for us in the light of this pandemic to think about what as it were, the pandemic analog of wearing your bike safety helmet is. Because I think that a lot of countries have very, very clearly not been very good at that. There's not been much action and not been much preparation for these sorts of events, and these sorts of events are a fact of life and always have been, right? It's just that we're working at timescales such that, the chances of me falling off my bike are very low, so why should I bother investing in helmets? Similarly, the chances of a pandemic is, once every insert number of years here, so I'm not going to worry much about it. Well, this is what happens if you don't. You get stuck with ameliorative, and I think we can all agree right now that ameliorative is extremely uncomfortable. It's not nice.
Ben, one species of response to the pandemic, especially in certain social media circles, on Twitter, has involved drawing attention to the drastic drop in air and water pollution that's corresponded with the responses to the pandemic, sort of social distancing and lockdowns. So for, there are these memes where, the birds are chirping in Wuhan and the water running through the canals of Venice are clear, and so on and so forth. In fact, to quote one user on Twitter, coronavirus is the vaccine and we're the virus. That's a particularly divisive way of putting the point, but do you think there's anything to this thought, or are there certain lessons that we could be learning here about our relationship to the environment?
I mean, that's a really, really great question. And a challenging one. I mean, I have certainly encountered those memes and people who are kind of celebrating the reduction in air pollution. I just saw an article yesterday that suggested that now for the first time in 30 years, a bunch of folks in India can see the Himalayas. And, in a way, there is stuff to celebrate there. Maybe even a bit of good news that we get to see nature kind of like creeping back in relatively rapidly. But I really think it's a mistake to applaud this or to be gleeful about this. I mean, I think for a variety of reasons. Obviously, one is that there's a lot of suffering going on in the world right now, and though we may want to, focus on a few good things here and there to sort of lift our spirits, these are not the kind of good things that we want to see linked with, all the terrible stuff that's happening in the world. I think, just from an optical standpoint, it's really bad for the environmental community to take that road. I mean, it just doesn't seem like it's going to be productive politically to suggest that, for instance, this is the kind of future that the environmental community is striving for. So I have great concerns that somehow, the kind of the primitivism of some branches of the environmental community might sort of take center stage or become the narrative that that the environmental community has been trying to escape from for many years. I mean, I think also it's just, it's a little bit premature to suggest that this is going to be a banner year for the environment. In fact, it may be a pretty terrible year, going forward. Among other things, in times of crisis like this, when there's a great economic threat or when economies are put into jeopardy, it's almost universally the case that economies and states will look to their natural resources in order to buttress their economy, to rebuild their economy. This happens repeatedly after wars or when there's a kind of a political collapse of some sort after a coup. So it's not difficult to imagine that soon enough, we're going to see a cry for people to sort of like move back into the forests, start extracting, our mineral resources, extracting our natural resources in order to boost the economy. That doesn't always work out well, typically, because it's not a sustainable way of living. But that's just kind of the way that things go typically, and that's unfortunate. And I think I'm actually writing a kind of an op-ed with a former student of mine about this right now. But there's an additional worry, which is that as we focus on this kind of like the crisis, the pandemic crisis, and it takes center stage, it tends to kind of crowd out so many other environmental issues. So there'll be a real strong tendency to just sort of like loosen or release ourselves from some environmental restrictions that have otherwise been keeping nature in play. This has a kind of a double-edged feature, and that's that on one hand, so we can imagine we'd lose some of our most important environmental regulations or restrictions in the name of trying to boost the economy. And we can imagine that it's not difficult to imagine that once these restrictions are removed, obviously sort of then industry may have carte blanche to do continued damage to the environment, but it's also possibly the case that the economy won't be robust enough for those extractive industries to continue extracting in the way that they had initially planned to. So if you just kind of imagine like, the restrictions that are preventing oil exploration in ANWR, the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, it is easy to imagine that the political actors, involved in that struggle are already in place to try to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for exploration. They may do that. They may, in fact, introduce, they may begin building roads and putting in all the infrastructure that's required for extraction in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, which is actually the source of much of the damage that environmentalists are worried about, and then not even be able to extract because the price of oil is so low. So you can imagine it's kind of a double whammy problem. So I'm not clear that like trumpeting the sort of the small victories with regard to like clearing of the air or the reduction in extraction and consumption is necessarily smart politically, nor is it clearly or maybe it's just a little bit too soon to say that this is going to be so great for the environment.
The coronavirus is unlikely, absent some serious social failures, to present an existential risk to humanity. But it has drawn attention to the possibility that the pandemic down the line that might threaten our continual survival. So Adrian, When discussing existential risks, some people have drawn a distinction between, on the one hand, natural risks, like an asteroid hitting the Earth or a super volcano or what have you, and on the other hand, anthropomorphic risks like nuclear war or killer AI robots. And the thought is that we can sort of derive a more accurate estimate of the risk of extinction in the former case than in the latter case, because we have sort of a track record to look back. And I'm just curious, like, should we think of pandemics as natural risks or as anthropomorphic risks, or is this even a useful distinction to be making at all in this context?
Okay. Seems like an existential risk is a risk to the existence of something. Standardly, we think about this as the existence of, say, the human species, or maybe human civilization, sentient life on Earth, something like that. One thing that I think as a philosopher is really interesting about an existential risk is that it's a little bit different than the way that people standardly think about risks. Where standardly, risk is very quantified, right? Risk is, number of life years lost or amount of money lost. Whereas existential risks have this kind of, they're not quite quantifiable in the same sense because the thing is gone, right? It's part of what I think is sort of quite interesting about thinking about these risks. But anyway, we don't need to worry about the sort of fancy philosophical stuff. We just need to say an existential risk is a risk to humans, broadly construed. And existential risks do make you think, when you're thinking about existential risks, you start thinking in some sense kind of callously. So the sort of thing you might say about something like COVID-19 is, yeah, lots and lots and lots and lots of people will die. Is this a threat to our species? No, right? But that doesn't mean that COVID-19 is not actually incredibly important for thinking about existential risk, because they link up in two, I think, quite interesting ways. One, you've already pointed to. One is the difference between, as it were, anthropomorphic risks that, as it were, we do to ourselves, and natural risks that kind of happen to us. And this is quite of a natural way for people to think about these kinds of risks, because after all, we see them in movies all the time, right? How does humanity get wiped out? Well, a big asteroid hits us, or we invent a super virus or Terminator or something like that, right? These are the kind of narratives ready for us. But the big problem with that distinction, of course, is that there's kind of no such thing, sort of, as a natural existential risk, because what makes something an existential risk is in part turning on how prepared the society is for it. So there's a certain sense in which we can think about what's going on with COVID-19 as being sort of natural, in the sense that we should imagine like pandemics are a thing that are going to happen, right? It requires some pretty impressive sci-fi thinking to imagine a human society where there is not the basically inevitability of pandemics occurring, right? So it's a thing that's going to happen. So in some sense, it's like an asteroid hitting the Earth. Asteroid's going to hit the Earth, right? But of course, they're very different to asteroids hitting the Earth, because not only the chances of them occurring, but how bad that's going to be turns critically on the nature and resilience of the kind of systems that we have. Which brings us to, I think, the second thing I want to say about the way we think about existential risk, and it's linked to COVID-19, which is that we often think about existential risks in terms of what Karen Kuhlman's called sexy risks, right? We often think about, I've already said, big rocks hitting the Earth, killer robots, ridiculous science fiction pandemics that kill everyone, right? That's not what you get very often. It's possible. What I think is more interesting when we think about existential risks are what Kuhlman calls unsexy risks, which are really just cascades of bad things happening, right? One way in which we could all go a bad way would be great big rock hits the Earth, or insert something about artificial intelligence, something. But another way it can go is we have unresilient systems. We have systems that are interconnected in problematic ways and are fragile in problematic ways and can't handle certain types of shocks. Now, I'd be surprised if COVID-19 itself constituted one of these shocks, but you can see by the way that various countries are reacting to this, that different systems are more or less resilient to different types of shocks. And if you're interested in the long-term survival of our species and maybe even the flourishing of it, then we really need to think hard about how you create systems that can be resilient against these kinds of impacts. So in terms of the natural versus anthropomorphic conceptions of risk, I think that COVID-19 is a really nice, as it were, middle ground. It's a really nice sort of example of how actually a lot of the time it's a combination of the world doing something to us and then us being prepared or not being prepared, right? In terms of what it teaches us for thinking about risks more generally, we shouldn't think about risks as one-off, the opposite of a magic bullet, or a magic bullet fixes things where it screws everything up. We need to think of them as things which are intimately tied in with the way we organize our societies and the kinds of infrastructure that we have organized. And a kind of very basic lesson I take it is that if you spend a long time letting your infrastructure and letting that resilience fall away, then when that opposite of a magic bullet comes, you're going to be in a lot of trouble.
Ben, I mean, you have some interesting work on our conception of the natural. So I wonder if you might touch on that and weigh in here as well.
Yeah, I do. I appreciate a lot of what Adrian is saying. Yeah, so I sort of wrote a book on this. The book is titled The Wild and the Wicked, on nature and human nature. It effectively cuts across this division between the sort of the natural and the anthropogenic. And I really kind of take a strong view against, so many of our kind of, ethical systems that make appeals to nature, let's say, as a sort of a thing, or the value of nature is something that should be guiding us, or something along those lines. This is a little bit less pandemic related, but maybe related to this point about sort of events and actions. And basically, I mean, I'm kind of building on what Adrian is suggesting here, but I think a lot of our moral discourse, maybe our political and our economic discourse, is rooted in a lot of this value talk, a lot of this nature talk, maybe even some of the risk talk. And that, I don't find that always so helpful. I mean, I think in a way, the way that we should be thinking about these kinds of problems is, by asking ourselves, what kinds of things can we be responsible for? What kinds of things are we responsible for? And then further asking, when we take actions, what can we justify, and how do we justify those actions, or those policies, or those principles, whatever that is that should be guiding us. So I'm kind of a Rawlsian about this, in that I think that, what we should be doing as a collective, as a community, is trying to find ways to sort of minimize bad luck, let's say, minimize the harms or damages caused to us by just kind of a misfortune or brute nature. And then at the same time, acknowledge that sometimes we get ourselves into predicaments because we take risks that are maybe warranted or not so warranted. I mean, I could go on in great depth about my book, obviously, but I think that the sort of the simple takeaway that I just would want to stress here is that the question of whether this is a sort of a natural phenomenon or an unnatural phenomenon is in a way immaterial to the question of what we need to do in response to it. And I think wherever we can we should try to again work together as much as possible, and make sure that we have some kind of infrastructure that makes it possible for us to work together, to strategize as a collective community, to address this problem, which I think pretty much anybody agrees, from no matter what your moral or political stance is something we would like to avoid.
Let me ask you, Ben, a question about the collective. So often when we talk about health, it's cast in individualistic terms. But one lesson, that we might want to draw from the pandemic is that we shouldn't think of health in this way. It seems like, my health we're learning, very dependent on the health of the people around me in my community. So do you think there's a collective notion of health? And if so, how should we understand it? And how does it relate to health understood in a more individualistic way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I guess I would put it a little bit differently than you did, but yeah, I do think that there's a collective notion of health. There's a sense in which my family can be healthy. Obviously, it can be healthy, in terms of like our interrelations, in terms of our relationship, but it can also be healthy in the sense that like, what I do in a way has bearing on my family, it has bearing on my neighbors, had bearing on, people I've not met who are sort of across town and so on. So it's clearly the case. I guess I've argued, and I argued in the past when I wrote on Ebola, that we really have to think about viruses a little bit more broadly as well. So this maybe I'll attack your question from a slightly different perspective, which is that, it's sort of our inclination when we first encounter these kinds of pandemics is to try to sort of like bone up on whatever rudimentary epidemiology or virology we might have like somehow picked up along the way, or maybe we just try to, partake in crash courses of virology. But I really think that to understand disease and the impact of disease, we have to think very broadly and sociologically and maybe even philosophically about the nature of disease. I wrote a piece on Ebola in the past where I, suggested that sort of, the mechanism by which Ebola propagates, isn't, it isn't contact or blood or sweat, right? Or bodily fluids, as was being suggested by so many in the virology community, but rather propagates by way of love and caring. And that sounds super squishy and weird, and I admit that, but at the same time, I mean, the truth is like, that's the primary mechanism through which Ebola transmits itself, because, parents go to hug their children, children go to hug their parents, family members go to love one another, and the disease spreads that way. This disease is a little bit different. It preys on our social networks because it is, on one hand, it's got this like long lag time, it appears, that lasts about 2 weeks or more before it really sort of sets in and takes root such that you wouldn't be in contact with other people. It doesn't affect the young in anywhere nearly as severely as it affects the old. And so it happens to attack our social networks of people who are the most active, the people who live most closely together, young students, let's say, college students, younger kids, maybe even 30-somethings who are active in the workplace. They're living often closely together in apartment buildings and so on. And it just kind of quietly propagates through those communities. While they're going about their business, they're also, 2 weeks in the future, essentially passing this along and killing people in a way that I think we have to sort of factor into our thinking about the disease. So I don't know if that directly answers the question about the sort of the broad collective notion of health, but I think hopefully it sort of kind of angles in at a
yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Can I come in briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. Please jump on in it.
Sure. Something that was hanging out in the background of what Ben was saying that I think is maybe worth making explicit, which is in some sense irrelevant of the sort of philosophical question of whether or not can I have a population level community conception of health, is I think we're extremely often encouraged to think about health in individualistic terms. I'm taking this risk for myself, and we occasionally try and say, well, you shouldn't smoke because on the one hand, there's secondary smoking, but more importantly, if you get sick, that's going to put, something on the health system, but that's not really said very seriously. It's much more just like, no, my health is my decision. And something which a pandemic just lays bare is that's utter nonsense. That, the health of an individual is something which is socially situated and socially embedded in ways that is inextricable. There's just no way that I can think about my own health in a pandemic as not being deeply interrelated with the community I'm in, the country I'm in, and the social systems I'm in. And so irrelevant of the sort of philosophical question, is there a community notion of health I can bear? In this context, the idea that we should be individualistic about health, in that sense I was sort of picking out, just becomes, I think, ludicrous.
Yeah.
It's probably time we should move to a Q&A from the audience. So I'm gonna pass things over to my colleague, Simone Gubler, who will ask some questions that have come up while we've been talking.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question that we have is a joint question. I've amalgamated two. So Savannah and Xavier both have questions about our interconnected world and about the importance and difficulty of working together in responding to the pandemic. And so I'll use Savannah's framing here. She writes, how does handing responsibilities to individual states differ in efficacy from adopting an individualized nation-state response or even a coherent global response?
One thing, I'm going to put my, actually, let me put my existential risk hat back on to answer this question. So one thing that is kind of weird about thinking about things like existential risk is that there's something kind of good for the future in terms of us having diverse responses across different nations, right? Because you, in some sense, kind of want nations adopting different strategies because you kind of want to know what happens when different states adopt the strategies. Having said that, of course, I don't want to be in the states that happen to adopt the risky strategies. So I think there's a really interesting trade-off here between how much we can learn about pandemics, right? Like ideally, this is a great natural experiment. I can just get all the different nations to do slightly different things and see what happens, right? But of course, people are dying and this is a really, really bad situation. So that's a horrible way of thinking about it. And so my immediate reaction to that question is there's a kind of very abstract way of thinking about it, where actually you do want a diversity of responses from different countries because we don't know what the right response is. But we probably shouldn't be thinking abstractly like that, right? It's immediately obvious what's problematic about that. And I do think that there's something, it's very obvious here in Europe, right? Because of course, Britain has disconnected itself from the EU's response. And I think it's quite obvious that that has been not good. So it does seem, given our interconnectedness, that this is a scenario that you might think the nation state is not particularly well set up to respond to. But Ben, if you...
Yeah, so I really want to add to this. So I agree with Adrian, and actually, in many ways, when this first broke out, I remember looking at Japan's response, Singapore's response, China's response, Hong Kong's response, and they were all different. And at times, at that time, I was having conversations with a few other people about how fascinating it is that one country is able to sort of like tamp it down successfully, and other countries having these outbreaks and so on. That I thought was that was amazing, and it was easy to sort of sit essentially in this spot. Really, I'm sitting in the same place I was then, and think, wow, from the standpoint of like adaptive management, right? It's informative to know this. The problem is that unless we can absolutely lock down our borders, right, this experimentation methodology is not going to work. China is able to lock down its border. We live in a globalized world. China can lock down its borders, close its ports, and do whatever it wants to do. It's got 1.5 billion people, and presumably they'll be able to weather the storm, right, without sort of re-importing the disease. But in Europe, in the United States, if let's say the state of, I don't want to pick on a state, but I'll just pick one arbitrarily. If the state of Alabama doesn't engage in takes a really risky strategy and doesn't do anything to sort of like reduce spread in their community, I mean, that's bad news for other people in the state, in the rest of the United States, if it's the case that we're able to move about. So I really feel strongly that, maybe whole continents need to sort of like work together to find one strategy that they all abide by. And I will just add that I'm not a huge fan of the lockdown approach. I think that it's got all sorts of problems, but it's a strategy, and it feels like whatever strategy we choose, we have to be on the same page no matter where we are. So I'll abide by a lockdown for the time being. And I think you should too. We have to choose one path and go down that route, and we can't have like 5 different paths and kind of experiment, because it's just going to come back to bite us.
So that actually segues us nicely into Jeff's question. So Jeff asks, and maybe now we can reflect a little on how things have played out and draw some conclusions. So Jeff asks, Ben, reflecting on could you reflect on what sort of infrastructure you think that we need politically in light of the pandemic?
That's, I don't know. I mean, it would be a really nice time to reclaim democracy and make it more democratic and a lot less combative, a lot less interest-seeking, a lot less stakeholder-driven. I mean, we've seen corruption of the democratic institutions, I think, across the globe in recent years. That's in Western Europe, in South America, and obviously in the United States as well. This is an opportunity in a way for us to sort of recover some kind of dignity and integrity in our democratic institutions. I can't really sort of like spell out what that might look like apart from just suggesting that wherever we can, maybe at the local level and at the national level, it seems like we have to fight very vigorously for intelligent discourse, more than we ever have. And to insist that our political leaders and policymakers essentially work together without manipulating one another, and also without being opportunistic about whatever pursuits they may have in better times, in times when it doesn't really matter as much.
So I've got an elegant little question from James here for both of you. So James asks, viruses, alive or not?
That's Adrian.
I'm a philosopher of biology, so I can. I tend to be the kind of philosopher who's not that interested in questions of trying to demarcate kinds. I think that biology is messy and extremely graded. And so trying to sort of grab here's one way of putting it: we should expect in biology things to be messy and vague. And so pointing out that there are some vague things is just to be expected. So viruses, I think, are one of the many interesting vague cases between being alive and not being alive. Any particular definition of life might include viruses, might exclude viruses, but that's not really, we shouldn't expect there to be clear and clean answers to those kinds of questions. For what it's worth, hey, they evolve, they interact with living systems, sure, they're alive.
So Ben, this one's for you. Sarah writes, you mentioned at one point the troubling role that primitivism can play in some branches of the environmental movement. So could you talk a little more about how that plays out and why we should be wary of this tendency?
Well, I mean, basically, so just to fill in the gaps here, primitivism is, not the most popular or well articulated view within the environmental community, but it does nevertheless have its proponents. Basically, the idea is like we should just kind of return to the Stone Age, or so the caricature goes, because post-industrial civilization is fundamentally exploitative or destructive, or there are a lot of different kinds of arguments that might advance such a primitivism. I mean, I think there's an important sense in which primitivism is a kind of a self-undermining view, in as much as it tends to be the kind of thing that upsets people. So I mean, the earliest story to tell really about the early phase, maybe first wave environmental movement was in one of the first issues of the Earth First Journal, there was an article published by a person who went by the pen name Miss Anthropy, and this person suggested that that essentially AIDS was a disease that was going to rid. So this is very similar to what's being argued now. That AIDS was a disease that was going to rid the planet of humans, which was this virus that was taking over the planet. I think that's not palatable to most people. I mean, simply from politically speaking, to envision ourselves as a kind of disease. We may share some characteristics, in terms of population growth, in terms of resource consumption, in terms of damage that we can do to the environment with viruses, or with other kinds of ecological systems that play a somewhat destructive role. But I mean, maybe to dwell a little bit on points that I've made in other places, I think it's a mistake of the environmental community to focus so strongly on the value of nature and kind of what's lost in our consumption of nature and our use of nature, and not instead focus on things like what we can justify using. That seems to me the primary environmental question, and the question that really is, at base for a lot of environmentalists, which is basically, why are we using so much stuff in a way that seems so reckless or so unjustified or so kind of wanton?
I've got a question that's just come in from Ashton, and they write, I've seen some people saying that people/humanity aren't the disease, capitalism is. What do you think of focusing on systems that humans have created, like capitalism, as opposed to features of our nature? that we can hold fixed when we're talking about these problems and our responses to them.
I think it would be a mistake to sort of try and attach any particular claim to something like human nature. I don't think that one of the thing that's extremely distinctive about humans as species is how plastic we are. So there's not like some, I guess there are some properties, like I've got eyes that face forward and have 3-color vision and I'm bipedal and so forth, but that doesn't make me human, right? Humans are extraordinarily plastic. So one thing, I guess, that's wrong with the kind of primitivism that Ben was complaining about earlier is precisely that it assumes that there's a way of there's a way or the way of being humans. There is a way that humans behave. That's not what humans are about. Humans are about behaving in a myriad ways and adapting ourselves to the situations we find ourselves within. And so, of course, if I were to agree that humans are the disease, what I'm going to have to say, given that I think that, is something like humans currently have some pretty crappy systems. So then the question, is capitalism a sort of good system? I happen to think it's not great, particularly if unregulated in the way that it tends to be at the moment, right? So I've said a few things tonight already about, this afternoon for you, that what is important is having resilient systems. What we want are systems that are able to handle certain types of shocks in a way that also makes sure that people can live good lives, right? Because it's really easy to make quite a resilient system if I just make everyone's lives terrible. I want to balance people having freedoms with having a system that can handle pandemics, the occasional volcano, so on and so forth. And I think that a system, here's one way of putting it, if you've got a capitalistic system that sets you up where the norm for your systems is working to capacity, then as soon as there's any kind of disaster, any kind of wobble, you're screwed. So insofar as a capitalistic system is one that encourages current systems to work to capacity, which we've seen good evidence in lots of countries that it is at the moment, then it's going to be terrible for dealing with things like pandemics.
And this actually leads us nicely to a question that Isa's just asked, where she's obviously interested in optimism. So she's asking, can we hope that we as human beings can develop resilient systems of response for natural disasters? And do you have any hope at the moment of us doing this?
I do have a lot of hope that we can do that. I mean, I think that, among other things, this is a wake-up call for us. I think, it illustrates in many ways how the world can go crooked, and how rapidly it can go crooked. We are going to face down many more challenges like this in the future of, our communities and in our families and broadly in terms of global challenges. I mean, climate change is obviously, peering over the horizon at us. We're going to have to deal with that. And that's a much more slower burn. I think that what this really points out, maybe this speaks a little bit to the prior question as well, that there are ways to kind of shore up some of the existing systems, and we can do that, let's say capitalism in this particular case, and we can do that by safeguarding against calamity or against cases of, essentially bad or brute luck. I think it's important to recognize, though, and we didn't really talk about this, but this is something that interests me a lot, that it's coming up a lot now in conversations about the pandemic as well, that any system that we impose is going to be one in which, every person on the planet who is affected by that imposition, by that mechanism or response or insurance regime or whatever it is going to respond to that insurance regime and change their behavior, effectively changing the outcome that system was put into place to try to address. So we find this regularly, in public policy interventions, that people engage in, they'll just change their exposure to risk by virtue of the fact that there's a new policy mechanism in place or a new insurance regime in place. So I think that, as we find adaptive, more resilient systems to address problems like pandemics or climate change or other environmental issues, whatever those may be, we're going to find that people are going to adapt as well. And, and capitalists will adapt, and socialists will adapt, and political actors will adapt, and that will change then those systems going forward. So, the good news is, like, as philosophers and economists and policymakers, we're always going to be employed trying to solve these problems. The bad news is we're always going to have problems. And unfortunately, as Adrian says, we're plastic, that's so we can address these things.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. And we've got some great ones on the table, but maybe I'll ask one that's a little fun. So Adrian, Maddie wanted to ask you about your work in the philosophy of paleobiology. She asks, can you tell us a little bit about what we can learn from studying the early fossil record as philosophers? What sort of questions are philosophers concerned with when they consider the dinosaurs?
Okay, well, there's a whole lot of them. So the central one that a lot of us work on is just questions of knowledge. It's just a question of, how can I know about the past? So we've been talking a lot tonight about pandemics, and pandemics generate these really interesting epistemic questions, right? I can't do an experiment to try and understand a pandemic. I've got complicated populations. Similarly, it doesn't look like I can do an experiment to understand a dinosaur, because, I guess birds are dinosaurs, but, in the relevant sense of dinosaur, I can't just grab one and put it in a lab, right? And so there are these interesting questions about how is it that we have a science of a thing which is so inaccessible to us, right? And so that's sort of one sort of set of questions, but maybe something I think is more interesting for the current purposes, if we're interested in thinking about, we've been talking a lot about resilient systems, these sorts of things. I think the biggest thing we can learn by looking at the past is the idea that things can change. We tend to view the world as being the way it's always been, right? I look at the way things currently are, and I go, yeah, this is the way the world is. This is the way it's always been, right? You see this all the time in the way that people think about the 20th and 21st centuries, right? But 100 million years ago, there were no flowers. There were no flowers. There were like ferns and stuff, there weren't any flowers. Then there were flowers, and the world profoundly changed, right? A world with flowers is completely different than a world without flowers, because a world with flowers has bees, it has pollinating insects, that changes huge whole ecosystems, right? These are very, very different worlds that you might live in. And so I think the thing that's the most profound thing we learn from studying the past is actually the past is much more different than we may have thought. What this tells us is that the way things are now is not necessarily the way they will be into the future. Just because we've had a temperature, a global temperature that's acted this particular way over the last 100 years, doesn't mean it'll act like that in the next 10 years. Just because we haven't had to stay inside our houses for God knows how long, because there's a global pandemic for a good 80 years, doesn't mean that won't be what we're doing for the next year. And so one of the things we learn from studying history and really understanding the complexities and the idiosyncrasies of history is that you can't take the norm for granted.
Thank you. So now I'm going to pass it back to my colleague Ryan, and he's going to close us out.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists, Ben, Adrian, thank you. And I want to thank everyone who for showing up. This was a delight. And I want to remind everyone that we will be back next week with another installment of PPE in a time of pandemic. Next week's topic is universal basic income and the coronavirus crisis. It'll be hosted by Fabian Bent.